This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. In 1998, Jeffrey Epstein acquired a small island in the U.S. Virgin Islands that would later become one of the most discussed private properties in modern criminal investigations. The island was Little St. James, located just a few miles southeast of St. Thomas in the Caribbean. Property records confirm that Epstein purchased the island for approximately $7.95 million, transforming it into one of several residences connected to his expanding real estate network. At the time, the purchase did not generate international attention. Private island acquisitions were not unusual among wealthy investors during the late 1990s. Across the Caribbean, islands were frequently bought by entrepreneurs, celebrities, and financiers seeking privacy and exclusive retreats. Epstein's purchase fit that pattern. Little St. James covered roughly 70 to 75 acres of land surrounded by clear coastal waters and coral reefs. Its location offered both isolation and convenience. While physically separated from the mainland, it remained close enough to St. Thomas to allow easy travel by boat. This balance between privacy and accessibility made the island attractive as a private estate. Following the purchase, development began. Construction permits and satellite imagery from the early 2000s show that the island gradually transformed from a relatively undeveloped landscape into a complex private compound. Buildings appeared on elevated terrain overlooking the ocean, including a large main residence and multiple guest houses. Infrastructure expanded as well. Paths and service roads connected different areas of the island. Dock facilities were built to allow boats to arrive from nearby marinas. Support buildings for staff and maintenance operations were constructed across the property. None of these developments were unusual for a privately owned island estate. Large properties typically require housing for staff, storage facilities, and transportation access points. Building permits filed with territorial authorities documented much of this development as it occurred. For several years after the purchase, Little St. James remained largely outside public scrutiny. It existed primarily as one of several residences connected to Epstein's lifestyle and social network. Guests traveled through nearby airports, then completed the journey by boat. Staff and service providers maintained the estate as part of routine operations. But the island's role would eventually change. As allegations against Epstein surfaced in the mid-2000s and later investigations expanded, Little St. James moved from private retreat to a location referenced in legal filings and investigative reports. What had once been simply a secluded Caribbean property became a focal point of global attention. And the timeline of that transformation begins with the purchase itself. After acquiring Little St. James in 1998, Jeffrey Epstein began developing the island into a large private estate. Throughout the early 2000s, construction projects gradually transformed the property from a mostly undeveloped island into a complex residential compound. Development occurred in stages. Construction permits filed with authorities in the U.S. Virgin Islands documented several building projects across the property. These permits included plans for residential structures, guest accommodations, staff housing, and support facilities necessary to maintain an isolated estate. Satellite imagery from the period confirms these changes. Images from the early 2000s show new buildings appearing across elevated sections of the island. A large main residence was constructed overlooking the surrounding waters, positioned at one of the highest points on the property. Nearby, additional buildings were added that appeared to function as guest houses and auxiliary residences. Infrastructure followed the expansion. Narrow roads and pathways connected the different buildings, allowing vehicles and maintenance crews to move across the island. Dock facilities were extended along the coastline so that boats could arrive directly from nearby islands such as St. Thomas. Because Little St. James has no runway, boat access became the primary method of reaching the property after arriving in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This transportation pattern was common for private islands in the region. Visitors typically flew into nearby airports and then traveled by boat for the final leg of the journey. Little St. James followed this model. Construction also included operational buildings needed to sustain long-term activity on the island. Maintenance structures, storage facilities, and staff housing allowed the estate to operate independently from the mainland for extended periods. Over time, the island evolved into a fully functioning private compound. From the outside, these developments appeared consistent with other high-end Caribbean estates owned by wealthy individuals. Private docks, guest villas, and support buildings are common features of large island properties. During this period, the island attracted little global attention. Its development was largely documented only through property records, construction permits, and satellite imagery. Public discussion about the island remained minimal, and most of its activities occurred beyond the view of the wider public. That situation would begin to change in the mid-2000s. As legal scrutiny surrounding Epstein increased in Florida, investigators and journalists started examining his network of properties more closely. Little St. James, because of its isolation and role within Epstein's travel network, gradually became part of those inquiries. By the mid-2000s, scrutiny surrounding Jeffrey Epstein began to increase, and with it, greater attention turned toward the locations connected to his activities. One of the earliest major investigations into Epstein began in Palm Beach, Florida, in 2005. Local law enforcement started examining allegations involving the sexual abuse of minors. As investigators reviewed testimony and travel patterns connected to the case, they also began mapping the broader network of properties associated with Epstein. Little St. James gradually entered that conversation. While the initial investigation centered on Florida, statements gathered during the inquiry referenced multiple locations connected to Epstein's residences. Testimony collected during legal proceedings suggested that some individuals had traveled between different properties over time. These locations included homes in Florida, New York, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Little St. James, because of its privacy and distance from mainland locations, drew particular interest among journalists and investigators reviewing Epstein's real estate holdings. Court filings from civil lawsuits later referenced the island as one of several places connected to allegations of misconduct. These references did not emerge all at once. Rather, they appeared gradually through legal documents, depositions, and sworn statements submitted during ongoing litigation. This process illustrates how investigations often develop. Information surfaces through testimony, supporting documents, and interviews conducted during legal proceedings. As these materials accumulate, investigators begin identifying patterns in travel, locations, and individuals connected to a case. Little St. James became part of that evolving record. At the same time, the island itself remained a privately owned property. Activity on the island continued, and construction projects that had begun earlier in the decade were already completed or nearing completion. From the outside, the estate still appeared similar to other private island residences in the Caribbean. Yet the context surrounding it was beginning to shift. The mid-2000s investigations marked the first period when Epstein's network of properties, including Little St. James, started appearing in legal documentation connected to allegations against him. Those early references would later take on greater significance as additional lawsuits and investigative reporting expanded the timeline. What had once been a largely unknown island was slowly becoming a documented location within a growing legal case. And as more testimony surfaced, attention toward the island continued to increase. In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein's legal situation reached a critical moment that would shape public perception of both him and the properties connected to his life, including Little St. James. After a lengthy investigation in Florida, Epstein entered a non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors. Instead of facing federal charges that had been under consideration, he pleaded guilty in state court to charges related to the solicitation of minors. The agreement became one of the most controversial legal arrangements in modern criminal justice discussions. Epstein ultimately served 13 months in a county jail facility in Palm Beach, under conditions that later drew significant public criticism. Reports indicated that he was permitted work release privileges during portions of his sentence, allowing him to leave the facility for extended periods during the day. At the time, the full details of the agreement were not widely known outside legal circles. For many observers, the case appeared to conclude quietly. The plea deal resolved the immediate prosecution in Florida, and Epstein returned to his network of residences and business activities after serving his sentence. Little St. James remained one of those residences. The island itself was not the central focus of the 2008 criminal case, but it remained part of the broader collection of properties linked to Epstein. Travel between his various homes, including those in New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, continued to occur in the years following the agreement. Public attention during this period was relatively limited. Although some journalists and legal analysts criticized the terms of the deal, the case did not immediately become the international story it would later become. For several years, the details surrounding Epstein's network of properties, including Little St. James, remained largely outside global headlines. Yet the agreement did not end legal scrutiny. Civil lawsuits filed by several victims continued to move through the courts. These cases produced additional documents, depositions, and testimony related to Epstein's activities and the locations connected to them. As more information entered the public record, investigators and journalists began re-examining earlier events. Little St. James appeared periodically in those documents, gradually strengthening its association with the broader story surrounding Epstein. What seemed in 2008 like the conclusion of a legal case would later be viewed very differently. Because nearly a decade later, new reporting and renewed investigations would bring Epstein, and his island, back into the center of global attention. As the new decade began, Jeffrey Epstein had largely returned to private life following his 2008 conviction. His properties, including residences in New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, remained part of his routine travel and social activities. For several years, public attention toward his case remained relatively limited. However, legal proceedings connected to civil lawsuits continued in the background. Several individuals who had previously accused Epstein of abuse pursued legal action seeking damages and accountability. These cases gradually produced depositions, court filings, and testimony that expanded the public record surrounding Epstein's activities. Little St. James appeared periodically in those legal materials. References to the island emerged through sworn statements and litigation documents that described travel between Epstein's various residences. Although the cases focused primarily on allegations and damages rather than criminal prosecution, the filings contributed to a growing body of documentation connected to Epstein's network of properties. At the same time, investigative journalists began re-examining the earlier Florida case. Reporters reviewed court records, interviewed individuals connected to the investigation, and analyzed the circumstances surrounding the 2008 plea agreement. Questions about how the case had been handled gradually moved into wider public discussion. By the mid-2010s, media coverage started to revisit Epstein's past with renewed intensity. Articles published by major news organizations examined both the legal agreement reached in 2008 and the broader system that had allowed Epstein to maintain relationships with influential figures despite the earlier conviction. This renewed attention brought greater focus to the locations associated with him. Little St. James, because of its isolation and its appearance in various legal filings, increasingly became part of the public narrative surrounding the case. Satellite imagery, aerial photographs, and property records were reviewed by journalists attempting to understand the scale and layout of the estate. The island's reputation began to shift. What had once been a little-known private property was gradually becoming a recognizable symbol within the larger story of Epstein's network. Yet the most dramatic change in the timeline had not yet occurred. Because by the end of the decade, federal prosecutors would reopen the case, transforming Epstein's story from a controversial legal episode into a major international investigation. In July 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in New York on federal charges related to sex trafficking involving minors. The case immediately attracted international attention and reopened questions that had lingered since the earlier Florida investigation. For the first time in more than a decade, Epstein faced a new criminal prosecution at the federal level. Authorities alleged that Epstein had operated a network involving the recruitment and exploitation of underage girls between the early 2000s and mid-2000s. The charges were filed in the Southern District of New York, marking a major shift from the earlier state-level case in Florida. With the new charges came renewed scrutiny of Epstein's properties. Investigators reviewed locations that had appeared in earlier testimony and civil litigation, including residences in Manhattan, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Little St. James quickly returned to the center of public discussion. Media outlets around the world began publishing reports examining the island's role within Epstein's network of properties. Satellite imagery, aerial photographs, and maritime routes were analyzed in an effort to understand how the island functioned as part of Epstein's lifestyle. Journalists also revisited earlier legal documents that had referenced travel to the island. The location itself became widely recognized. Little St. James was no longer simply a private Caribbean estate known to a small circle of associates. It had become a highly visible symbol connected to the allegations against Epstein. Law enforcement also turned its attention toward the island. In the weeks following Epstein's arrest, investigators prepared to examine properties that might contain evidence connected to the federal case. Authorities later conducted searches associated with the investigation in the U.S. Virgin Islands, including activity on Little St. James. These developments unfolded rapidly. News coverage expanded across television, newspapers, and online media platforms. The island's name began appearing in headlines worldwide, often accompanied by aerial images showing the estate's buildings and coastline. The timeline that had begun quietly in 1998 with a real estate purchase had now reached a moment of global attention. Little St. James had moved from private retreat to internationally recognized location within a major criminal investigation. But before the federal case could proceed to trial, events took another unexpected turn. In August 2019, the federal case against Jeffrey Epstein took an unexpected and dramatic turn. Just weeks after his arrest in New York, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Authorities later ruled the death a suicide, bringing the criminal prosecution against him to an abrupt end before the case could proceed to trial. The timing had significant consequences. A federal trial would have provided an opportunity for prosecutors to present evidence, call witnesses, and outline the full scope of their allegations in court. Without that process, many details that might have emerged during testimony remained outside public examination. The investigation itself did not entirely stop. Federal authorities continued reviewing evidence connected to Epstein's activities, and attention remained focused on the network of individuals and properties that had been associated with him over the years. Little St. James remained one of those locations. Shortly after Epstein's death, law enforcement officers conducted searches on the island as part of the broader investigative effort. Reports from journalists and local observers confirmed that federal agents and investigators visited the property, examining buildings and collecting materials that could potentially relate to ongoing inquiries. These searches were conducted quietly but were widely reported. Images of investigators arriving by boat circulated in news coverage, reinforcing the island's growing reputation as a central location in the Epstein story. However, the absence of a criminal trial meant that many questions about the island's role would not be answered through courtroom proceedings. Instead, information about Little St. James continued to emerge gradually through other channels. Civil litigation, investigative reporting, and public records became the primary sources for understanding what had occurred on the island and how it fit within the broader timeline. The investigation had changed form. Rather than a single criminal trial focused on Epstein himself, the story continued through lawsuits, journalistic inquiry, and ongoing legal scrutiny surrounding his associates and estate. For the island, this moment marked another turning point. Little St. James was no longer simply a location mentioned in allegations. It had become a site directly connected to federal investigative activity. Yet the timeline did not end there. After Jeffrey Epstein's death in 2019, the criminal case against him formally ended. However, the broader legal process surrounding his activities did not disappear. Instead, the focus shifted toward civil litigation, financial investigations, and cases involving individuals connected to his network. During 2020 and 2021, multiple legal proceedings continued in courts across the United States. Victims who had previously accused Epstein of abuse pursued civil lawsuits against his estate, seeking compensation and formal recognition of the harm they had experienced. These cases produced additional court filings, depositions, and records that expanded the public understanding of Epstein's operations and the locations associated with them. Little St. James remained part of that legal landscape. Although the island itself was not the central focus of every lawsuit, it continued to appear in references connected to Epstein's network of properties. Legal documents and testimony describing travel patterns and events sometimes included the island among the places linked to earlier allegations. At the same time, attention turned toward individuals who had been associated with Epstein. One of the most significant cases involved Ghislaine Maxwell, a longtime associate of Epstein who was arrested in July 2020. Prosecutors alleged that Maxwell had helped recruit and groom underage girls for Epstein during the period when the abuse occurred. Her trial in federal court took place in late 2021. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented testimony from multiple witnesses describing the recruitment process and the environments in which abuse had occurred. Although the trial focused on Maxwell's actions rather than the properties themselves, locations connected to Epstein, including his residences, remained part of the broader narrative surrounding the case. The jury ultimately found Maxwell guilty on several counts related to sex trafficking and conspiracy. This verdict represented one of the most significant legal outcomes connected to Epstein's network following his death. It confirmed that federal prosecutors continued pursuing accountability even after the original defendant could no longer be tried. Meanwhile, Little St. James remained physically unchanged but symbolically transformed. What had once been a secluded private estate was now widely recognized as a location tied to one of the most high-profile criminal investigations of the decade. And as lawsuits and legal proceedings continued, questions about the island's future began to emerge. As legal proceedings connected to Jeffrey Epstein continued in the years after his death, attention gradually shifted toward the future of the properties he had once owned. Among them, Little St. James remained the most widely known. By the early 2020s, Epstein's estate was managing several assets while also addressing claims from victims through compensation programs and legal settlements. Selling major properties became part of that process. Little St. James and the nearby island Great St. James, which Epstein had purchased in 2016, were placed on the market. Together, the two islands represented a large and highly visible portion of Epstein's former holdings in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Real estate listings described the properties as rare private island opportunities, emphasizing their size, coastline, and proximity to St. Thomas. However, the history associated with the islands made the sale unusual. Potential buyers were aware that the properties had become internationally recognized because of their connection to the Epstein investigation. As a result, any future use of the islands would likely attract public attention. In 2023, the islands were purchased by a new owner. Reports confirmed that Stephen Dekoff, an investor and private equity executive, acquired Little St. James and Great St. James through his investment firm. The purchase price was reported to be approximately $60 million, covering both islands. The acquisition marked a major shift in the timeline. For the first time since 1998, Little St. James was no longer owned by Epstein or his estate. Control of the property had passed to a completely new owner with plans to redevelop the islands. According to public statements, the new ownership group proposed transforming the properties into a luxury resort destination focused on tourism and economic development in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Such redevelopment would represent a dramatic change from the island's previous role as private residential estates. Yet the legacy of the location remained complicated. Because of its association with Epstein's crimes, the island had become deeply embedded in public memory. Any effort to redevelop the property would inevitably confront that history. Ownership may have changed, but the symbolic meaning attached to Little St. James had not disappeared. The timeline that began with a quiet real estate purchase in 1998 had now reached another turning point. Today, Little St. James stands as one of the most widely recognized private islands in modern history, largely because of its connection to Jeffrey Epstein and the allegations surrounding his activities. The property's physical features, its main residence, guest houses, and docks, remain, but the public narrative surrounding the island is far more prominent than the structures themselves. Even with new ownership, Little St. James continues to evoke discussion, investigation, and analysis. The island has become a symbol within broader conversations about power, wealth, and accountability, illustrating how private spaces can intersect with global attention when legal and criminal matters involve high-profile individuals. Civil litigation, media coverage, and investigative reporting have contributed to this visibility. Court documents filed after Epstein's death, along with statements from victims and associates, created a record that keeps the island at the center of public awareness. Although Epstein can no longer be prosecuted, his estate, associates, and related financial networks remain subject to ongoing legal scrutiny. Journalists and documentarians frequently reference Little St. James when exploring Epstein's network. Its isolated location, combined with detailed property records, satellite imagery, and witness accounts, provide investigators and the public with a tangible point of focus. This documentation has allowed a more precise understanding of how the island functioned as part of Epstein's private operations. Public perception of the island is complex. On one hand, it represents a Caribbean estate with typical features for a high-net-worth individual: private residences, docking facilities, and isolated terrain. On the other hand, the documented history of alleged criminal activity on the property makes it a focal point for discussions about abuse, exploitation, and systemic failures to hold powerful figures accountable. The purchase and subsequent sale of Little St. James have also highlighted issues of legal and financial transparency. By transferring ownership to new parties, the estate has demonstrated how high-value properties tied to controversial histories can be redeveloped while retaining their symbolic significance. Any proposed development or change in use inevitably attracts scrutiny from both local authorities and the global public. The legacy of the island continues to be shaped by survivor voices, investigative journalists, and public debate. Little St. James is not merely a geographical location. It is a documented site that represents both the challenges of pursuing justice against influential individuals and the ongoing efforts to maintain accountability through legal and civil processes. Ultimately, the timeline of Little St. James, from its purchase in 1998, through development, legal scrutiny, and federal investigation, to its sale and continued public significance, illustrates the lasting impact of Jeffrey Epstein's actions and the enduring questions surrounding his network. This concludes our detailed timeline of Jeffrey Epstein's Little St. James, documenting how one secluded island became a global symbol of scrutiny, investigation, and historical importance. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.